In the last lecture, we had a look at event binding. Now, before focusing on two-way binding and explaining what this is, there's one other important thing you need to know about event binding. Let's say before this button, we also have a label, server name, and then more importantly, we have an input, which we maybe give a Bootstrap class of form control. Here, I want to allow the user to enter the name of the server, which should get created. So here we could listen to the input event. This is a normal DOM event provided by the input element, which is fired whenever the user types. And here we could execute on update server name because it will be fired on every keystroke. So let's add this method to our component here. And now I somehow want to output what the user entered right now, what the value of this field is. Now we can do this by passing $event here. And $event, super important, is kind of a reserved variable name you can use in the template when using event binding. For this event, so only between these quotation marks here, $event will simply be the data emitted with that event. So input and click are default events provided by the DOM, you could say, and they ship us some data when they are fired. The click event gives us an object which, for example, holds the coordinates where we clicked. And the input event also gives us some data, some information about the event. Now we can capture this data with $event passed as an argument to the method we're calling, or used anywhere between these quotation marks in the code we're executing. $event, something to keep in mind. Reserved word which gives us access to the event data. So now we pass this to onUpdate server name. So here we know we will receive this event, and this will be of type any for now. So now let's simply log it to the console so that we can see it in this debug log. If we do this, and I now type something here, watch the console on the right. A couple of outputs were written there, 4 to be precise, because I typed 4 characters, did 4 keystrokes, so the input event was fired 4 times. And if we have a look at this event, we got a couple of information here, for example, the target. And the target simply is the HTML element on which this event occurred. So here on the target, since this is an input element, if we scroll down, we also got the value test, and this is what the user entered. So what we can do now in our TypeScript code is we can set a server name property, which is an empty string by default, and then here in onUpdate server name, instead of logging it, we could say this server name, and we just learned that on the event, which is of type event as we now also saw, here we have a target, and on the target we have a value. Now this is only available because the target is of type input element though. This is why my IDE doesn't like it. We can explicitly inform it about the type in TypeScript by adding HTML input element here in front of it, like this. And again, this is just needed to inform TypeScript that we know that the type of the HTML element of this event will be an HTML input element. We do this explicit casting with this syntax, with the opening and closing tag, with the smaller and greater than sign and the type in between. So with that, we assign this value to our server name. What we can now do is, in the HTML file here, we can output this for now. So with string interpolation, we could output the server name below the input. If we save this and go back to this application, and I type test server here, you see this dynamically updates below the input. This is how you can use this $event object to fetch the event data. Now with that, let's move on to two-way data binding to kind of finish this little example app here for now. In the last lectures, we learned a lot about event binding and property binding. Now let's combine both to two-way binding. We learned that we can get the event data like this, for example. There is another approach too, though. If I copy this and then comment it out, and now I replace this input event here with something else, you will find that we have an even easier way of binding to some data. With two-way data binding, we combine property and event binding. We use it therefore by combining the syntaxes, squared brackets, and within these, parentheses. Now here we have to use a special directive, and we will learn more about directives in a second, ngModel. Now we can set this equal to some property defined in our TypeScript code, so to the server name for example. This setup will do the following. It will trigger on the input event and update the value of server name in our component automatically. On the other hand, since it is two-way binding, it will also update the value of the input element if we change server name somewhere else. And I can demonstrate this by going back to the TypeScript code and setting server name to test server here initially. So before it was an empty string, now it isn't anymore. With this, if we go back to the running application, you see that the input is pre-populated with that. Now if, for demo purposes, I comment in the other input, which does not use two-way binding, you see that this input is empty, because again, it's not using two-way binding. Now if I type something here, you see it updates the property name, and hence it updates it there where we use string interpolation, and in the other input. But if I type here, it's not getting changed in the first input, because again, we're not using two-way binding there. This is what two-way data binding is. A very simple way of binding in both directions and, for example, of reacting to changes in, well, the input value here. So I will comment out the first approach. I will leave the method in here though, even though we're not calling it anymore. But with that, you now also had a look at two-way binding, a nice and easy way of reacting to events in both directions. Now, let's fine-tune our app here a little bit more, and let's then move on to directives, another core feature of Angular. So with all four forms of data binding covered now, let's finish our little demo app for now. We got the server name, and this is live updated whilst we type due to two-way data binding in place here. I will comment out this server name here. Instead, I want to display the server name once we clicked this Add Server button. So once we create the server, we should not only say server was created, but also name is, and then simply add this server name like this. So now with this in place, we're now using the data we're changing through two-way data binding, or if we chose to do so through one-way data binding if we use the other approach, which is currently commented out. And with this in place, now you can see that if I change the server name like this and click Add Server, we see server was created, name is test server 2. With that, we're using all four forms of data binding together with each other, event binding to listen to the click, string interpolation to output the data here, property binding to enable this button in the first place after 2 seconds, and two-way binding to fetch our input data. So with that, we're pretty advanced into the basics of Angular. We use components, we know how they work in general. We use how to communicate with our templates from our TypeScript code and in the other direction. Now there's one more basic feature we have to cover to really be able to build first little applications before we then can dive deeper into the individual building blocks. So let's have a look at this next feature soon, directives. Before that, time to practice data binding though. So, were you successful? Here's my solution. We should add an input field. So I'll add a horizontal line again just to have some separation. And then my input field. The label of course is optional. I want the user to enter a username, so let's add an input which receives this class which is form control. If we save this and have a look at our application, this is how it looks like. Now if you don't want to have it sit directly on the edges, you can of course add some bootstrap styling to this. So maybe a container with a row inside of it, and then the call XS12 class. So feel free to wrap your content in there. It's not required for the solution of this, of course. So with that, we got our input field here with the username. Now let's bind this username to a property of our TypeScript file. So here I will add a new property to my app component, and I will name this property username. This will be a string, and I will set it to an empty string initially, like this. Now we learned that we can use two-way binding to bind to this. So on my input here, I'll add two-way binding by adding squared brackets and then parentheses. This is this two-way binding syntax, and then ngModel. Now with that added, I can bind to my username like this. Now important, for ngModel to work, you need to make sure that in your app module you have forms module added to the imports, because the ngModel directive technically is part of the forms module provided by Angular. So make sure that you have this. You should have it there by default when using a CLI project. And then with that, we should update the username on every keystroke. Now to be able to see that, I'll add a paragraph below the input, and here I want to output username. Now with that being output here, we can save this. ngserved should be running, of course, and we should see that if I enter supermax here, we see it below the input. So the first two tasks here are solved. Now let's add the button. So we'll add a button below the paragraph where I will say reset user. And this button will first of all receive some bootstrap classes, button primary, to make it look nice. But more importantly, we should disable it if the username is empty. Now how can we do that? We have learned that we can bind to the disabled property. Now, even though we used that a couple of times, that's of course not the only property you can bind to, but it's the one we will need here. Now, disabled. We could set disabled to some property which is true or false, or we directly set it to true or false. But as I explained, between the quotation marks, you simply have an expression which resolves to a true or false. Now, since we want to disable this, if the username is empty, we could simply check that between the quotation marks here. So we could say disable this if username, this property, is equal to an empty string. So two single quotation marks inside here. With this expression, this will return true if username is empty. Therefore, then this button will be disabled. Otherwise, it will be false and the button will be enabled. Let's see if this works as expected. After saving this, the button is indeed disabled at the beginning because username clearly is an empty string. But as soon as I type anything in here, you see it gets enabled. So this is how we can use property binding again with any expression which returns as the value the property we're binding to expects. So in the case of disabled, true or false. Now with that we get this solved too. Now we should also add a click listener to this button so that we can reset the username once we do click the button. So event binding with normal parentheses. Let's bind to click for this. And here we could call onReset, a method where we then set the username equal to an empty string. But since this is all we're going to do, I can also just say username equals empty string. And now don't mistake this for the syntax we used here on the disabled property. There we have 3 equal signs to check something. Here we have 1 equal sign to assign a value. With this in place, we should now be able to go back to the application, enter supermax here, and if I click reset user, it's empty and the button is disabled again because we reset the username string. And that is our assignment on data binding solved. I hope you enjoyed it.